Thank you, Glenn. Great to see you. Great to see everybody on here at 12 o'clock. Uh, what day is it? On a Wednesday. I'm sober too. Um, my name is Max and I'm an alcoholic and my sobriety date is June 16th, what? 1981. Hopefully by looking at me, that means I was like 4 when I got sober, which is somewhat true. We'll get into that in a little bit. Um, but I loved Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've lived in the solution of Alcoholics Anonymous since I've been here. And I'm one of these guys who I don't give the exact same talk every time I talk. I pray to God. I ask God to, talk through me and to carry the message. I didn't hear anybody real new when they did that, I don't believe, but I hope there's some people who are new here because that's what makes an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, in my experience. I do see some different states on here, Ohio, Arizona, and I drank in these states. I drank in a lot of states in Europe. Now, that's not that exciting to like most people, but I was 15 years old when I got sober. So I like to mention that because as young as I was, I drank in a lot of places. And I didn't just get sober because I drank, I blacked out one time and mom caught me and threw me in rehab. You know, um, I love telling my story. Zoom has been a fantastic thing. I am from New York. I moved down here literally 7 years ago on the 2nd of July. We were in Greenwich, Connecticut for a long time, but as Glenn knows, my home group was in Mamaroneck, New York, the Harbor Island group. And I got Glenn to come out a couple of times and tape our anniversaries, when Paul was there, a couple other people. And it was an enthusiastic group and an exciting group. And my friend Carolyn, who was our elder in the group, who was passing away when I moved down here, she said, "Now, Max, you don't go down there to Charleston and try to fix that AA," because she knew me. I helped start the Harbor Island group. I was very active. I was the first GSR, and I'll get into that later. But I love telling my story. And the reason I bring this up is up in New York, I was speaking a lot before I moved down here. And when I moved down here, it's just very different. It is different. There's not a lot of speaker meetings. It's very different than New York. I mean, because I used to go do kind of the whole tri-state thing. My sponsor got me to come speak with him a couple times, and it was just fun. And I moved down here and it just kind of came to a dead halt. I actually moved down here on the 2nd of July and went over to Atlanta to the international convention and was honored to speak on a panel there. And it was, you know, so when Zoom happened, when the pandemic happened and Zoom happened, I've been all over the country and New Zealand and like I heard some other people talking. I've been in a lot of places, and it's been fantastic. And my fellowship has just grown, and I love the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Love it, and it's an important, huge part of my sobriety. Though, as it says on page 17, that alone would not keep me sober. So all the fellowship I can have in the world, all the parties I can go to, down here in Charleston with all my friends, all, going to the diners with people after me, that's all great. And it's really good stuff, but it's not why I'm sober. I just celebrated 41 years, which is just really ridiculous. I got to be honest, like the older I get, thank you. I, uh, June 16th is my anniversary. And, it's, I got to be honest, it doesn't feel that long. And when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I had no interest in staying sober for 3 months. I'll never forget being 6 days sober. And a guy came down from open treatment and he had 52 days. And he was so enthusiastic about being sober. And he told a story. And I was like, I'm like, how does this guy staying sober 52 days? Because when you're 6 days sober and you haven't not had anything in your body for over 5 years, it's a little mind boggling that somebody hadn't, had anything in their body for 52 days. And I was not planning on staying there. Didn't think I'd be there in 52 days. Mom kind of tricked me into the whole thing. So I like telling my story because after my first year of recovery, and even in my first year, it was very recovery-based sobriety in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm from New York. I got sober in Louisiana. I spent my first year in Louisiana and moved back to New York. So I'm not from Louisiana, but I got sober there, and it's my Jerusalem, Baton Rouge. It's where I got sober, and it was fantastic and awesome. And I learned about the difference between fellowship and recovery. And I moved up to New York to the world famous Mamaroneck group, and it's solution. We had a big sign that said world famous from America, because Ray O'Keefe, wherever he went, it was world famous, right? So, but it was a solution based meeting. We had two beginner meetings, a big book meeting, a step meeting, a speaker meeting, and a regular step meeting. And it was steps. And I don't resonate with people, and I've heard it a lot, especially on Zoom. People who have been in AA for 10 years, 20 years, and they never heard the message. It's mind boggling to me. It really is. I don't know how you stayed sober. I mean, I do kind of, because my brother hasn't had a drink in 33 years and he can't stand AA. But if you want to hang out with my brother for a weekend, you'll know why you go to AA. Because, as Bob Pearson said, I don't go to AA to survive my drinking. I go to AA to survive my sobriety. And that is so true. So again, the reason I love telling my story is because that was such a solution-based area. We would go out and tell our stories, but it was always, 10 minutes on your story, and then you get into recovery. And they just weren't big on telling your story. And I when I was 12 years sober, they asked me to speak in Texas, and I was like, cool, how long do you want me to speak for? And they're like, 50 minutes. And I'm like, cool, 15, I got it. They're like, no. I was living in New York City at the time. And in New York City, typical AA meetings, 20-minute talk, the typical New York City meeting. I was like, cool, 50. And they're like, no, 50 minutes. I was like, I got sober at 15. They're like, well, just tell your whole story. I was like, okay. And there's a clock in the back, and it's like 8:05, and I start talking, and I'm like, I'm not going to make it. This guy wants me to talk till 8:50. The next thing I know, it's 8:40, and I'm in 8th grade, and I'm drinking, and I'm like, I got to get sober. I just couldn't stop talking about drinking, but I learned that night about time and how to tell my story, and I learned how to tell my story in an hour and all that stuff. But and it was fun, it was fun to learn that. And as Frank M used to say, because I used to tell him how much better the AA was in Westchester and New York City, because we talk about the steps and solution and blah, 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 and everybody in New York City, it doesn't matter what the topic is, they're going to tell their story, So I'm telling him that one night, and he's like, well, Max, if people don't tell their story, people don't know a miracle happened, and that's, the main reason I like to tell my story, because if you don't know that I can't ingest alcohol safely, and when I pick up a drink, I can't stop, I don't know what I'm doing talking about the 12 steps. They don't even make sense to me if that's not the case. And it obviously happened for me pretty early. I was born in Washington, D.C. and moved to Brooklyn when I was 1, Brooklyn, New York, and lived in Brooklyn until I was about 6. And my mother, who grew up in Scarsdale, my father grew up in Maryland. We moved out to Westchester, and my mom just wanted to get us out to Westchester, and we got out to Westchester, and my parents split when I was 7, and it was devastating. People don't, it's not why I'm an alcoholic, and nothing that happened to me before I started drinking made me an alcoholic. My brother beat me up all the time because my parents got divorced. He's a big guy, and it was brutal, right? None of that makes me an alcoholic. But the separation from my parents was emotionally brutal for me. And I don't think there's enough talked about it and written about it, about what divorce really does to somebody. And it definitely ripped me up inside. But when we moved, my mother and my brother and I moved towns, I had that feeling that I've heard from most podiums from Alcoholics Anonymous, that feeling of separation. I had the complete feeling of separation, did not fit in, and didn't know how to fit in. And prior to that, I felt like the king of the world. I felt like confidence on the inside, felt like everything. And I didn't know what to do. I mean, I just, and then I started to feel like a defect walking around looking for a character, literally. I couldn't use those words at the time, but just, I was a defective kid when I got sober. Before I got picked up a drink. It's why I love in the doctor's opinion where it says that we're not, convinced just because we're maladjusted to life that makes us alcoholic. It's one of my favorite lines in the book, because I was 100% maladjusted to life before I picked up a drink. And if I never picked up a drink and couldn't stop, I'd be doing something somewhere else, or I'd be dead, right? Because I was completely maladjusted to life. But when I was 10 years old, I had the great idea, because I had been trying to get that feeling on the inside that alcohol gave me, And there was a, camp out, and my brother, who's 2 years older than me, there was a big thing. It was about a week of planning, and we were going to drink, and we got these Pabst Blue Ribbon, quarts, and I was excited all week. I didn't know what I was excited for, but I was excited to start my alcoholism, I guess, right? But that weekend, I picked up a drink for the first time, and I didn't have the like a most amazing experience ever, but I got enough where it was like this is a better feeling than the way I normally feel. And it was just enough to let me do it again. And I had my first real drunk when I was 11. And I got that real feeling of like, this is fantastic. I felt out of body, I'm like, this is it. It came so naturally to me, drinking, Now, my grandfather was my main caretaker. Now, not because I watched him drink a half a bottle of vodka every day is why it came naturally. It was that feeling on the inside. And I started blacking out when I was 12, and I didn't know what that was. I just knew I couldn't remember what happened all afternoon. I would start drinking by myself or with friends. People were optional when I drank. I always like to say that I wanted to get drunk, right? So, and I wanted that feeling. And the reason I bring all this up is that I was 12 years old, and one thing I was really good at was swimming. I was a really good athlete. I was a fast kid. I was the fastest kid in my area, and I was a really fast swimmer. I swim to this day. It's something I love. And I was like a county champ and all that stuff. And my swim coach pulled me aside at 12 years old, and she said, "Max, you have a drinking problem." I'm like, because she saw me coming out of the woods drunk, which is where she got that from, right? I'm like, where is she getting all this from? And and I just completely blew it off. Like, what? Like, what are you talking about? And the book also, in Doctor's Opinion, talks about the frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices, right? And that was the first frothy emotional appeal that I got. I got a lot more between then and June 16th, 1981, because I kept drinking. I kept getting in trouble. The feelings of difference got stronger and stronger. The trouble got worse and worse. I remember going into junior high, where I went to school. It was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And by 7th grade, and where I grew up, you had jocks, you had freaks, and you had frocks. Jocks, frocks, and freaks. A jock is a jock, obviously, athlete. A frock is somebody who plays sports and parties all the time, and then a freak is somebody who just parties all the time. And it's the only way I can tell my story, because it's true, is in 7th grade, I was pretty much a jock until the end of 7th grade, when my drinking really kicked off. And I'd be kind of a frock, and into 8th grade. And at the end of 8th grade, I'm a full-on freak. All the people that I wouldn't hang out with, that drank, that I judged, I was hanging out with. They were my best friends, and the fights and I am very, very sensitive to bullying. When I see it, when I watch it, it's very hard for me, because I was a huge bully. My brother, big bully to me, obviously at home. And I'm a little guy. You can't really see here. I mean, I guess I could be any size, but I'm not a very tall person. I'm 5'8" on a good day, right? So I was a short kid, and I was little, but I was Tanner from the Bad News Bears, with a little more gumption. You know what I mean? And I was brutal to people. Brutal. I went to a party with my wife about 20 years ago, and the woman's like, "Hey, my husband says you picked on him when you were." I look over, and the guy's like 6'6", and I was like, "Is he mad?" And she's like, "No." But like, people don't forget when you abuse somebody, and there was a lot of that. That was a lot of my amends, was going and knocking on doors and doing stuff like that. But the drinking just kept going and kept getting worse and worse. Now, the trouble was happening in school. I got kicked out of school every year, and every time it was around drinking. And the last time I got kicked out, and I like to tell this story because it's important, in a timeline. In my 9th grade year, my brother and I had a keg party. I got drunk, and I bought a knife, and knives are a problem for me. I had earlier problems in my life with knives. I saw West Side Story when I was 6, and I brought a knife to school and tried to kill my best friend because that's what Riff did, you know? So knives were kind of a problem. And I bought a knife from this guy at the party, and I brought it to school the next day. And I can tell you the whole story. With a kid ended up with 24 stitches in his arm. And I didn't do the wielding of the knife, but I had been drinking. I brought the knife in, and it was my idea. And the cops are yelling at me. And all I can think about is the other keg party we're having that night. And I just, abused this guy. And the other guy actually did it. So I felt completely justified. And we're having another party. And the reason I think this is important is that this is a year plus before I got sober. And this is where I was at 14 years old. Cops had been involved before. Cops knocked on my door one Sunday morning and asked my mother about houses that had been destroyed up the street, and I was supposedly involved. And the guy who I did it with went to jail. But my mother did whatever she did, and I didn't have to go to jail. And that was another amends I had to make. So I was not a nice guy who drank too much, if you're getting all this, right? So I have a whole nother year of drinking, and my mother sends me away to boarding school because she got married to a guy who lived in New Orleans. And that's why I got sober in Baton Rouge. And I go up to boarding school, and I thought, you know what? This is going to be different. I'm going to change this time. I'm not going to drink the way I've been drinking. I'm not getting in any trouble. I kind of looked at myself in the mirror, and I was kind of like, I could change. I could be that jock again. I could be that healthy kid that I am naturally, well, that didn't work. I was smoking pot, an hour into being there, and drinking later that night. I have no choice over picking up something when it's out there, right? And that was a really bad year. Now, I just got to talk about 2 more things really quick. My sponsor used to talk about it all the time, that if alcohol is your problem, you're not an alcoholic. And if alcohol is your problem, you're not, right? Right. Alcohol is not your problem. You're not an alcoholic. If you're an alcoholic, alcohol is not your problem. And I believe this is what he means by this. In my 9th grade year, my mother had taken me to France for 2 weeks. And I'm in full drinking at this point. And I'm with my mother and my grandmother. And I was irritable, restless, and discontent like I had never been before. Because that was the first time in about 3.5 years that I was away from chemicals. And I was in France, in Paris, and my mom bought me some near beer at the Eiffel Tower. And that didn't do it. And it really upset me. And it got to the point about 9 days into it, I ran back to the hotel in Cannes and just drank a bottle of wine because I couldn't handle the feeling anymore. That's alcoholism. I couldn't handle that feeling sober. That's what makes me an alcoholic. The summer before I went to boarding school, I'm down in New Orleans. Those that don't know, people drink in New Orleans. I had been to 2 Mardi Gras and got really drunk, had embarrassed my mother, all kinds of stuff. My best friend, whose father was an alcoholic, wouldn't hang out and party with me. The first night I got there, I got really drunk. And for the whole rest of the month, he wouldn't let me drink. And my mother wouldn't let me drink. Again, very irritable, restlessness, and discontent. And my mother told me later, because she put me on a bus in Atlanta to send me back to New York, that she did it on purpose because the way I had been and acted was so horrible. She could have flown me up there, but she wanted to punish me. She didn't know how, but she's like, I'll put him on a bus, and that'll be pretty. And it's not a fun ride, right? But because I was an alcoholic without a drink, for probably a little bit less than a month. And when I got back to Larchmont, I took a drink with vengeance, like I had been in the desert, for a month. That's alcoholism. That's what makes me an alcoholic. Not, it's just like, Clancy used to talk about that spring that used to happen in his gut when he'd stopped drinking, when his baby died and he quit drinking, but that thing got tight in his gut and he had to drink. That I experienced a lot. So I'm up at boarding school. Things are getting really bad. Things got really bad. I broke this guy's senior project that he had been working on all year in a blackout. I had also tried to rob a store at apparently gunpoint, but I had no gun. But apparently they said I tried to do it at gunpoint. I don't know how, but I was so drunk. I probably, hey, give me your money, And it was just I should have been kicked out of the school, hands down. But my stepfather was a pretty influential guy, and he got me to stay in the school. And now I'm on probation. Now I'm really not supposed to drink. Okay. Now, getting sober at 15, I couldn't drink the way I drink every day, obviously, but I did something else. I smoked about 5 times a day because I just couldn't drink the way I did. And then I drank every chance I could. I was basically a periodic drunk the whole time I drank but I had something in my body every day for the most part. Right. And, and that's what's important. So I was kind of like, okay, that's not a big deal. I'll just smoke pot for this time, and I won't drink. Well, that only lasted until I needed a drink, and I needed a drink, and I got drunk again. And luckily I was like off campus, so I didn't get in any trouble. The next thing I know, I'm walking around Boston train station asking people who look like my parents to buy my watch, and things were just really bad. And then I got off the train drunk, and my father told me later when I was sober that was the first time he ever, was concerned. He said something was wrong. I could just tell looking at you something was wrong. My parents had been separated. My father was in my life, but when I was out at my father's, he and my stepmother worked in the city. So I could drink all day. I just basically could stay out of his eyesight. My mother was all over me, right, about drinking. I mean, she's crying, please stop drinking. Because she caught me drinking seven Bloody Marys at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't see what the problem was. And I'm yelling at her, I can't wait till I'm 18 so I can drink, and it's just bad. And just fast forward. So I'm on the porch drinking a vodka and orange juice, which was my grandfather's drink, and smoking a cigarette. And my mother calls me out, and she's like, you got to come down to New Orleans. She lied to me to get me to come down to New Orleans. And I got down there, and the night before we got there, she bought me a beer, and she said, look, on Tuesday, you're going into a youth treatment center for drugs and alcohol. And I was like, uh-oh. Like inside, I'm like, uh-oh. Because I had written a letter to a friend of mine, and I was so drunk and high, I put it in my science folder. My science teacher found it and sent it to my mother. And in the letter, I talked about all the drinking I was doing and all the stuff I was doing. And so the jig was up, right? But I'm like, dishonesty is my second nature. So I'm like, I'm going into this treatment center and I'm out of there. No problem. Like she said, Max, you're going in for 7 to 14 days. So it really wasn't that scary to me because I was so good at lying. I'm figuring I'm in there and then I'm out, and I'm back to Larchmont, and I'm drinking the way I want to drink, and everything's good. Well, she pulls up to this treatment center, and I don't know anything about AA, obviously. And I don't know anything about recovery. And I kind of figured I was going to a house, maybe a, nice, place with tennis courts and stuff. Well, it was a square hospital in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I look up, and there's a guy in the second floor window wearing pajamas, smoking a cigarette. And I was like, wow, that's so sad. Look at that guy up there with pajamas on, like, look like a psych patient, So, half hour later, I'm in pajamas. I got a cigarette. I'm looking out the window at my mother driving away, And that was the start of my recovery. And I was so terrified because I knew deep down I'm an alcoholic. And the first thing they did to me in that treatment center, not did to me, but the first thing they did in that treatment center is they said, this disease is about ISM, right? Ism, I, self, and me. And I'm like, that's it. I'm in trouble, And they did an intervention on me, and it was like the most intense, frothy emotional appeal I got. And I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And so I'm in this 7 to 14 day thing, and they're like, well, then you go up to open treatment and you work the first 5 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was like, what? And I'll tell you what, the 7 to 14 days gave me enough willingness to go upstairs. And that's where the guy came from with the 52 days to tell his story. And I went up there, and I'll just tell you I'm really into the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I want to get to that. But I like to tell my story, and it's pretty much my drinking story. And I hope I've conveyed well enough that I drink like an alcoholic. I 100% do. And just like the guy in the book that was bone dry for 25 years and then put on his carpet slippers, if I think that I can pick up a drink today and it'll be different, I know it will not be different. And I know that in the deep of my gut, and I don't know that because I have seen a ton of people go out and drink. But I just know that I know the way I drank. And it's, again, another reason I like telling my story, because it lets me remember the way I drink, and I can't pick up one drink safely. Right. So I'm in this treatment center, and I was telling you about the history and Dr. Bob's story, or not Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, on page 200. You can go check it out. It says, we all know that Dr. Bob basically did the first 9 steps in his first night. Okay. And it says there were treatment centers 40 years later that basically took this model where people had to do the first 5 steps. And that was the model I went through. And it was fantastic. It was basically through Hazelton. And we did the 4th step the way they did it before the book was written. And it was honest. You know, I think it's really important. And I love the big book, and I love the big book 4 step. But I think it's really important to remember what it says on the page about the bottom of page 65, where it says, we went through our lives and nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. You know, and the way they did the 4th step prior to the big book was they did a list of assets and liabilities. And that's what I did. So I'm in this treatment center, and I'm going through the steps, and I manipulate my counselor to get onto my 4th step. And this woman's like, you don't even have the first 3 steps. Why are you even starting a 4th step? I'm like, what are you talking about? And she knew I didn't have the first 3 steps. And she's like, well, tell me about the 2nd step. And I started telling her all these crazy things I did when I was drinking. She's like, that has nothing to do with the 2nd step. She's like, you think if you get out of here, you'll drink differently, or if you start drinking, you know, you don't care. And that's the deal. And if I drink today, I know I can't drink safely. Okay. I just told you that. I will drink on, I got to have a drink. I'm in so much pain, I have to have a drink. And I do not believe that somebody goes through the 12 steps, just my experience. And I don't believe that I'm going to walk through, as a recovered alcoholic, I'm going to walk through the grocery store today and I'm going to get, something's going to hit me and I'm going to pick up a drink with 41 years. I do not believe that. I do believe I could systematically go backwards in the steps. And the last thing that's going to happen is I'm going to lose that 2nd step. And I'm going to convince myself, which they spend 5 chapters in the book talking about, and I'm going to pick up a drink, right? They don't even get to the 3rd step till page 63, right? So there's a lot of chapters on make sure you know you're an alcoholic. Hopefully you can identify with all these stories, you know, Jim and Fred and all this stuff, right? So I get sober, and like I told you in the beginning, you know, Baton Rouge was fantastic sobriety, you know, and I learned what it talks about on page 17. I learned about the fellowship and recovery, because the fellowship was strong. I was young. There were a lot of young people. We had crawfish boils every weekend, you know, and then I move up to the world famous Mamaroneck group, you know, after my first year, and it was awesome and it was intense, right? But they got me through the steps, because I kind of came to a halt on my steps when I moved to New Orleans. Not on purpose, not that I didn't want to do them. I didn't have somebody, you know, pulling me through, you know, like I had been doing up to that point. And when I got into the Mamaroneck group, actually, I got Ray O'Keefe's son as my sponsor, and it was exciting. It was a really exciting time. Johnny H. was my first Unity breakfast speaker. You know, I remember going to hear him and laughing. I had actually heard Clancy in New Orleans a month earlier, and I just started to get a real taste that there's a whole nother world of Alcoholics Anonymous out here, you know? So this is a big part of my story. So I got sober, and as the page 63 talks about, we get, you know, that we're the actor, we want to run the whole show, we're self-centered, you know, we need God's help, all that stuff. Well, that happened to me, and I did the 4th step, and I went through the steps, and I started sponsoring people when I was 17 years old. And I'd like to think I sponsor people better today than I did when I was 17. Because when I was 17, I was sponsored a guy who was 35, and he was like, I'm having a hard time at work. And I was like, quit, you know? He was like, hey, listen, I'm having a hard time with my wife. I was like, leave her, you know? He was like, I was just full on, right? Like, didn't know what the hell I was doing. My sponsor's like, you're just supposed to take somebody through the 12 steps. You don't have business telling people other stuff. But I was enthusiastic, and I'll be grateful to, you know, I'm grateful every day that my sponsor threw me into sponsorship at that time. And again, I'm strong step group, and we're into it. But I got to a point where I started using the 12 steps and what it talks about in page 60 to 63, where you can be inconsiderate when even trying to be kind. And I started to manipulate things in my sobriety and doing a lot of dishonest stuff sober. And then I got into a relationship at 4 years. And I ended up having a breakdown after my 5th year, and like an emotional breakdown. Like I was just like, I don't want to live anymore. And it was all around the relationship. And it was really bad. And my sponsor, when I called him at 3 o'clock in the morning, he said, Max, I want you to read the third step in the 12 and 12. We were in a group where we studied the big book, and we did the 12 and 12. And that was the night at 3:30 in the morning where I saw the line that says, in fact, the effectiveness of the whole program will rest upon how well we turn our will and lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And I did that. And I remember listening to a talk by my sponsor, my later sponsor, when he said that more people kill themselves sober than drunk because they had nothing to stop it. And I was just in a completely mental state for 2 weeks. But I came out of that mental state after 2 weeks, completely out of that mental state with a spiritual experience. I had the most intense spiritual experience. I had one at 52 days, which I didn't talk about. But I had a really intense spiritual experience at 52 days, just like Bill. But like Bill, and if you guys ever read Solo Sponsorship or, any of the AA history, Bill was going through a hard time between his 5th and 6th year. And that's when he met Father Ed Dowling. And he talks about, in a winter night, when he talked to Father Ed all night, he said, that was the night I feel like I did my 5th step, right? So that's what happened to me. And it was like perfect timing, because that March of 1987, we started the Harbor Island group, and I became the first GSR. And everybody who started the group, we all knew everything. We could all talk on the steps, and we were strong on the steps, knew nothing about the traditions. And I was like, we should have a traditions meeting. And I started bringing people out from the Bronx, and Frank Mauser and Jimmy Shannon, all these people who were like versed in the traditions. And we were all sitting there like, what? Really? Like, there's good AA in other groups, because we obviously do it the best, for tradition, right? Every group's autonomous. That means my group is not the best. It's like, it's a scary place to be in AA when you think this is the only sobriety. And Bill talks about it, and as Bill sees it, where, this is the only kind of AA. It's not a good place. And that's where I was. And then I got on this committee, and we started the first Joe and Charlie. I don't know if Glenn did that one. He probably did, right? Joe and Charlie came in January of 1988, right? Or December of 1988. And it was the most powerful weekend. And the book came alive like I'd never seen. I was in a book study group. I knew the book was the text. I knew you started from the very beginning, all that stuff. But when, they did that seminar, it was like unbelievable. And Frank, did the history, and it was like, I had 2 opportunities to meet Lois, prior to that. I'm from where Bill and Lois lived. Okay. And I had no interest, which kills me. Okay. Because after I got to be, know Frank and have a relationship with Frank, and Frank was my spiritual sponsor for about 5 years. I got to have lunch with Mel Wing. I met Mel Barge. There's some really cool things, and things that I just cherish to this day so much, right? And Frank, whenever Frank would tell his story, and I like to make this point really big, that we can't ever be so cocky as a society, to think that we won't be here. And he always would talk about the Washingtonians. And if you look at the Washingtonians' history from 1840 to about 1843, they had 100 to 300,000 people sober. Depending on what paper you read, after 4 years, there was like 500,000 people sober. Look at AA's growth from 1935 to 1941, right? Until the book came out, and then the Jack Alexander article, we got 8,000 people sober. So, but they got into other things, and he always would talk about the 10th tradition. And it's so important that we don't get into other things, right? And Frank would say we can't be cocky, and he would talk about bringing the traditions into your life. And Frank taught me the traditions. He took me to page 96 of AA Comes of Age, and he said, we're starting here, and we went through the traditions. And it's powerful, when you start understanding what this beautiful thing you're a part of. And I just started understanding, that I have a lot to learn. I was 10 years sober in Frank's group in New York City, in the Oxford group. And, again, autonomy, their meeting was 1 hour with an 8-minute coffee break. And my first group conscience meeting, I was like, what the hell is this? It's an hour meeting, and you break for 8 minutes. Like, where's the sharing? And all the old timers in the group were like, well, Max, that's when you go up and talk to the newcomer and help them. Oh, duh, And I learned so much from Frank. Frank taught me that if I'm not willing to be a greeter and a coffee guy at a group, I have no business being in the front of the room, being at the podium, you know. And I just learned service at a whole new level. I went to the 1995 convention in San Diego with, hung out with Frank a lot. I've never shook more hands in my life. I'm shaking everybody's hand and then some. I'm having people sign my book. I have the book with people from China, Germany. I mean, it's, hey, sign my book. They didn't even understand me, and I was signing it. It was just exciting stuff, right? AA is, just stayed exciting for me. I went through a lot of work. Now, let me just say this really important point. Me, I like to relate myself to Bill a lot. Hey, I don't think it's an ego thing, but I really relate to Bill a lot. But I struggled a lot with emotional attachments to other people and dependency on other people, big time. But through the work with Frank and through the big book work, I couldn't have married my wife if I hadn't gone through that work. If I didn't get to the point where I wasn't selfish and self-centered like I had been in sobriety. And I met my wife when I was 13 years sober, 14 years sober. We were sober, got married when I was 15 years sober. And it was beautiful. And Frank was at the wedding and my sponsor was at the wedding. And and I had 15 guys at my wedding party. And it talks about it on page 89 and working with others. We're going to get a life, beyond our wildest dreams, basically, that watching people recover, watching the loneliness vanish, all that stuff. It's an experience you must not miss. We know you will not want to miss it, it says. And I'm trying to let you know that what it talks about on page 152 in Vision for You, that do we have a substitute that's greater than just not drinking, is yes. It's so far beyond that. It's the calm I have. So I was going to say this right up front, but I was so frazzled when I got on here. So I work at the Home Depot, which is a mile from my house. And Glenn asked me to do this. And I'm like, cool, I can do it. And I just spilled a whole bunch of paint right before I came here. I was in a complete what? I was like, I got to go to Tennessee and save a bunch of drunks. And people are like, what? What are you talking about? Yeah, I go to Tennessee. But the whole thing is AA is, because of service, AA has stayed exciting for me. I'm a big 10, 11, and 12 guy. I'm not a big, let's talk about them. I'm a big, I need to practice 10, 11, and 12. My sponsor's really big on, meditation and prayer that's the powerhouse of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's 32 words in the 11th step. As Ray O'Keefe used to say, that's the powerhouse of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's where we get the power. My sponsor's really big on inventory. My sponsor's like, there's all these meditation meetings popping up everywhere. People are sitting quiet and they're meditating. He's like, where are the inventory meetings? Right? Because as Bill says, when you put them together, you end up with an unshakable foundation for life. And that is the deal right there. The deal is, I work at the Home Depot. I'm out in the world like everybody else. As my sponsor used to say, I don't ever, ever rise above basic human being in sobriety. I don't get 41 years and then I get special clothes, or a special car. And I have seen more people go out on, I didn't get this. The guy who wrote Member's Eye View, he talks about that if you're getting sober for something or to get something back, you got to get that really clear, that sobriety has to be an end in itself, and then of course, helping others. I'm sponsoring 2 brand new guys right now, and I've never not sponsored anybody ever. Now the pandemic threw me into a little I can't find any new people, right? But I ended up finding some new people on Zoom. I go to this Texas meeting pretty much every night at 9:00. And I actually went down there in January and spoke at a thing with my sponsor. And if you guys hadn't heard, so I got Clancy when I was 19 years sober. Pete is my sponsor in New York. And when I moved to Virginia, Pete's like, you need to get a sponsor. And I had been talking to Clancy because I was sponsoring a whole bunch of guys in New York. And I used to call Clancy for advice because I knew he sponsored a bunch of people. And I moved back to Westchester 10 months later to Greenwich. And I was like, Pete, what do I do? He's like, well, don't get rid of Clancy. So I had Clancy for 20 years, and Pete liked that I wrote Clancy every week, every Tuesday, and then we would talk every Wednesday. And you know, some things you guys might not, you know, a lot of people know Clancy's this circuit speaker. He spoke all over the world. You know, but something you might not know is when you were his sponsee or baby, he called him, he would go out of the country and I would get a handwritten postcard, which like blew my mind, right? We talk about 7-step, we talk about action, we talk about getting out of ourselves, right? He wouldn't just like, I'd literally get a handwritten postcard. I mean, who the heck does that? I was driving him through Times Square one time. He's like, Max, stop. I'm like, why? He's like, I need to get postcards for my daughters. It was just so beautiful, right? It's like, that's the kind of sobriety that I want. And I was just going to lead up to kind of where I'm going to end. I think it was 2 years ago. Those that don't know, Clancy died, I think, right? It was August 24th, right? A year and a half, 2 years ago. And my birthday is in September, a month later, and went out for my birthday. My wife, when we were out, and I'm going to have a hard time not crying when I tell the story, but it's a beautiful story. We're out to dinner, and my wife says, I'm going to give you your present when we get home. So, okay, you know. And when we get home, she hands me an envelope. And I'm like, divorce papers. That's first thought, right? Still not that well, but we had a beautiful night. And she gives me this thing, and I open it up, and it's all the postcards that Clancy had sent me. I'm not a sentimental person. I'm not one that actually keeps things, right? Like, you know, but she does. And those that know Sharon C, I'm very close with her as well. And I got this stack of postcards, and my wife wrote me a letter, and she said, I knew one day he'd be gone, and you'd want these. And it was the most beautiful thing I could have ever gotten, you know, to have, you know, these postcards of actions that a guy took that loved me and that I loved him. And the reason I brought up Sharon, who I got even closer with during the pandemic, on top of all of them were one postcard that Sharon sent me years ago when she was with Casey. I mean, she never sent me postcards. For some reason, she sent me one somewhere, and it was beautiful. And that's what you get in sobriety is you get a wife who loves you, who's going to give you a present. You know, you're going to take actions. I just had a weekend with my mother that I couldn't have planned. I think Lily's on here, my good friend Lily. She knows. Sharon helped me with my mother during the pandemic because I'm sober 41 years. My mother precedes me by 3 months in Al-Anon, right? And we've always had a really tough relationship. And Sharon helped me because Sharon said to me one day, she said, Max, one mother, one lifetime. I want you to just think about that, you know? And since then, the actions, I can't change my mother, but I can change my actions. And my mother wanted to come down here for her 85th birthday. And so I said, yeah, okay. And I got to be honest, I was not excited. My brother called me up. He's like, Max, I don't have a good feeling about this, you know? And my mother had a beautiful 85th birthday. She felt loved. And, you know, unfortunately, she has a lot of really hard relationships that she creates, but it's not my thing. My thing is to love her and be there for her. And I can't do that without you. I can't do that without the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and sponsorship and people who call me sponsor. And I'm just so grateful that I still have sponsees that, like I said, I'm taking 2 guys through the steps right now. And, you know, it's been really awesome because newcomers don't change. You know, they're all different. But it's amazing how the excuses are the same, you know, and they all really excited to do their 4-step until you tell them to do it. And then you ask them how they're doing it, and they're like, oh, I'm working on it. As Ray used to say, that's code. That's code for I want to drink. You know what I mean? So it's an action program, and I'm glad that I've had people in my life that have just kept me in the actions of Alcoholics Anonymous. I can't thank Glenn enough for asking me. I want to make this kind of public announcement. I do the speakers for my home group, which is in Charleston. My home group, by the way, is the Holy City Speaker Group, which meets Friday night at 7:30 and Monday night 7:30 for a Big Book meeting. But if anybody has 3 years and over, I put my number in the chat. You guys come to Charleston. I need speakers for our Friday night. So 3 years, been through the 12 steps. Give me a call and I'll book you up until next April. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say. Glenn, God bless you. Thanks for having me speak.